Welcome to Bedtime Science. Did you know that a woman with ADHD is, on average, diagnosed nearly 5 years later than a man with the same condition, often after spending years believing something else was wrong? Tonight we explore how ADHD, the same condition carried in the same brain circuits, can look and feel so different depending on whether you are a man or a woman. In the next moments, we will gently discuss how dopamine shapes attention and motivation, why hyperactivity often hides inside the female mind as racing thoughts rather than restless legs, how estrogen rises and falls chain, the way ADHD medication works across a single month, and why so many women receive a diagnosis of depression or anxiety years before anyone mentions ADHD. Before we begin, if you find comfort here tonight, stay tuned for more updates. And if you are still awake, you can leave a soft comment about what topic we should explore next. Now let's begin. Deep inside your brain right now, a molecule is doing quiet work. It is small, invisible, and it shapes nearly everything you do without your knowing. That molecule is dopamine. You've probably heard the name before, in conversations about pleasure, about addiction, about staying focused at your desk. But dopamine is not simply the brain's reward chemical. That description, while common, is a partial sketch of something far more involved, something more like a universal currency that the brain spends on motivation, craving, and the simple act of wanting what comes next. Dopamine is produced in small clusters of neurons located deep in the midbrain, in a region called the ventral tegmental area and another called the substantia nigra. From these tiny origins, dopamine reaches upward into the prefrontal cortex, the striatum, the nucleus accumbens. These are areas responsible for planning, for motivation, for movement, for the feeling that something is worth pursuing. Think of dopamine not as pleasure itself, but as the chemical that tells your brain something matters. It is the voice that whispers, "Pay attention to this." The nudge that says, "This is worth your effort." And in ADHD, that voice speaks more quietly than it should. Not because the brain is broken, not because anything dramatic has gone wrong. The baseline level of dopamine, the resting tone of the whole system, simply runs a little lower than it does in a neurotypical brain. Picture a radio that's tuned just slightly below the frequency of the station you want. The signal exists, the broadcast is happening, but there's static and some words vanish into noise. That's what a lower dopamine baseline feels like from the inside. The world is full of signals, tasks to complete, conversations to follow, plans to remember. But the brain's ability to lock onto those signals and hold them steady is weakened. Not by laziness, not by a failure of character, by chemistry, plain and simple. The prefrontal cortex, that region just behind your forehead, is where much of this difficulty concentrates. It handles what scientists call executive function. Your ability to plan, to organize, to hold several pieces of information in mind at once, to resist an impulse, to choose a delayed reward over an immediate one. Your prefrontal cortex is sensitive to dopamine, exquisitely so. It follows what researchers describe as an inverted U-shaped curve. Too little dopamine and performance drops. Too much and performance drops again. The zone in the middle is narrow. In a brain with ADHD, the resting dopamine level often sits on the low side of that curve. The prefrontal cortex struggles to do its job, not because the tissue is damaged, but because the chemical environment it depends upon runs too quiet. Here is where it gets interesting. When people talk about ADHD, they usually talk about attention. Makes sense. The name itself contains that word. But dopamine doesn't only serve attention. It also drives motivation, emotional regulation, the sense of reward that follows effort, and the impulse to begin something new. Two major dopamine circuits are involved. One runs from the midbrain to the prefrontal cortex and supports executive control, planning, working memory, impulse management. The other runs from the midbrain to the nucleus accumbens and the ventral striatum. This second one governs motivation, reward, and the feeling that an activity is worth continuing. In ADHD, both circuits can be affected. That's why the condition is not just about distraction. It concerns a brain that has difficulty generating the internal push to begin a task, to sustain effort through a dull stretch, to feel that what you're doing right now deserves your continued energy. And this is why stimulant medications work the way they do. It seems counterintuitive at first. A person whose mind is restless, and you give them a stimulant, but the logic becomes clear when you understand the dopamine picture. Stimulant medications like methylphenidate and amphetamine-based compounds increase the availability of dopamine and norepinephrine in the brain. They don't flood the system with pleasure. What they do is raise the baseline just enough to move the prefrontal cortex into its best working range. The static quiets, the signal clarifies, the person can hear the station they've been trying to tune into all along. One dose doesn't produce euphoria. It produces function. It lets the brain do what it was always trying to do, focus and follow through, by providing the chemical foundation that was too quiet on its own. Now, if dopamine were the whole story, ADHD would look the same in everyone who has it. Same symptoms, same behaviors, same path through life. But it doesn't, not at all. And the reason starts with something most people don't associate with attention: hormones. Your brain does not exist in isolation. It sits immersed in a chemical bath that shifts constantly. Hormones produced in the ovaries, the testes, the adrenal glands cross the blood-brain barrier and interact directly with neurotransmitter systems, including dopamine. One hormone in particular has a deep relationship with the dopamine system: estrogen. Estrogen, specifically estradiol, the major form of estrogen circulating in reproductive age women, does not simply float past the dopamine system. It actively modulates it through at least 4 distinct pathways. First, estrogen stimulates the enzymes that produce dopamine, increasing the raw supply. Second, it reduces dopamine reuptake at the synapse, meaning the molecule stays active longer before being recycled back into the neuron that released it. Third, it inhibits monoamine oxidase, the enzyme responsible for breaking dopamine down. With less breakdown, more dopamine remains available in the spaces between neurons. Fourth, estrogen increases the density of dopamine receptors in key brain regions, making those regions more responsive to whatever dopamine is present. 4 pathways, all pushing in the same direction: more dopamine activity, more prefrontal support, better executive function. Researcher Emily Jacobs, working at the University of California, demonstrated that natural fluctuations in estradiol predict working memory performance in healthy young women through dopaminergic mechanisms. Estrogen is not peripheral to how the brain focuses. It is one of the primary regulators of that whole process. and this creates a very specific consequence for women carrying an ADHD brain. The menstrual cycle is not just a reproductive event. For a woman with ADHD, it is a monthly cycle of neurochemical change that predictably shifts symptom severity and medication effectiveness. During the follicular phase, roughly the first 14 days, estrogen rises steadily. Dopamine activity increases alongside it. Many women with ADHD report that this window feels clearer. Medication seems to work well. Focus comes more easily. Emotional regulation holds together. Then ovulation arrives. Estrogen peaks. For a brief window near the middle of the cycle, the brain's dopamine environment may be at its most supportive. But after ovulation, the scene shifts. Progesterone rises, estrogen falls, and during the luteal phase, roughly days 15 through 28, many women with ADHD experience noticeable worsening. Inattention increases, emotional regulation becomes harder, impulsivity returns. The mind feels foggier, heavier, slower. The same medication dose that felt effective 2 weeks ago can feel almost useless. This is not imagined. It reflects the underlying neurochemistry directly. The stimulant medication is doing the same thing it always does, raising dopamine availability by a fixed amount. But the baseline it acts upon has shifted downward as estrogen declined. The boost is no longer enough to reach that narrow optimal zone. Dr. Lotta Borg Skoglund, a physician and researcher at the Karolinska Institutet in Stockholm, describes the mechanism in precise terms. Estrogen and progesterone pass easily through the blood-brain barrier. The brain is full of receptors for these hormones, receptors involved in emotional regulation and cognitive functioning. Dopamine, heavily implicated in ADHD, is modulated by estrogen. Professor Sandra Coolidge, based at Amsterdam Medical Center, puts it another way. The hypothesis, she explains, is that dysregulated dopamine levels in the ADHD brain interact with fluctuating estrogen levels. Estrogen appears to enhance dopamine activity, leading to better cognition, memory, and stable mood. When both are dysregulated or low, mood and ADHD symptoms may increase. Now imagine a woman who doesn't know she has ADHD. 2 weeks of every month she manages. She keeps the plates spinning. She meets her deadlines, holds conversations, copes with the daily mess of adult life. Then the other 2 weeks arrive, and everything becomes harder. She loses her keys more often. She can't finish sentences. She cries at things that wouldn't normally bother her. She feels like she's failing at something everyone else does naturally. She doesn't connect this pattern to her menstrual cycle. Neither does her doctor. The explanation offered might be stress, or perhaps premenstrual dysphoric disorder. The ADHD hiding beneath the hormonal rhythm stays hidden for another month. And another. This pattern extends beyond the monthly cycle. It reaches into the larger hormonal transitions of a woman's life, moments when estrogen undergoes dramatic, sustained shifts. Puberty is one such moment. When estrogen surges during adolescence, the dopamine system is remodeled. For some girls, this is the point when ADHD symptoms either appear for the first time or intensify in ways nobody expected. The quiet child who managed in primary school begins to struggle in secondary school, not because the work got harder, but because the hormonal environment changed beneath her. Research on early pubertal timing has shown that girls who enter puberty earlier face higher risk for mental health difficulties. For girls carrying an undiagnosed ADHD brain, puberty can be the moment when the compensatory strategies they've relied on begin to crack under the weight of new neurochemical demands. And then there is perimenopause. If the menstrual cycle creates monthly oscillations in estrogen, perimenopause creates a sustained upheaval lasting years. Typically beginning in the early to mid-40s, perimenopause is a time when estrogen levels don't simply decline. They fluctuate erratically, spiking and dropping without the predictable rhythm the body has known for decades. For women with ADHD, researchers describe a double impact. Hormonal changes that affect all women, layered on top of an existing vulnerability in the dopamine system that estrogen had been actively supporting. Some women report that medications that worked reliably for years stop working. Brain fog deepens. Emotional regulation deteriorates. Some women receive their very first ADHD diagnosis during perimenopause because the hormonal buffer that had been partially concealing the underlying condition is finally pulled away. And estrogen doesn't regulate dopamine alone. It also modulates acetylcholine, which supports memory and learning. It modulates serotonin, which supports mood. It modulates norepinephrine, which supports attention and arousal. When estrogen becomes erratic, all of these systems shift at once. The ADHD brain, already running on a thinner margin, feels every fluctuation. A 2025 systematic review led by Professor Coolidge confirmed what clinicians had observed for years. Hormonal transitions across the female lifespan, from puberty through menstrual cycling, through pregnancy, through perimenopause, represent distinct windows of heightened vulnerability for women with ADHD. Research even suggests that women with ADHD may experience earlier onset of perimenopause. The connection between the dopamine system and reproductive hormones may run deeper than anyone initially assumed. Let your mind drift back now to a primary school classroom. A boy is moving. He can't stay in his seat. He taps his pencil against the desk. He blurts out answers before the teacher finishes the question. He bumps into other children in the hallway. He is energetic, disruptive, visible. A girl sits 3 rows away. She's staring out the window. Her notebook is open, but the page is blank. She heard the teacher's question but lost the thread halfway through. She's thinking about something that happened at breakfast, also about a song, also about what her friend said yesterday, all at once. The boy gets referred for evaluation. The girl gets told to pay attention. This is the origin of the diagnostic gap, not in biology alone, but in visibility. The diagnostic image of ADHD was built on the male presentation, the disruptive child, the moving body, the externalizing behavior. That image was encoded into early diagnostic criteria. It was carried forward through decades of teacher referral patterns and clinical training. It captures one expression of a neurobiological trait, but it's not the only one. ADHD has more than one face. The hyperactive impulsive presentation, the version most people picture when they hear the word ADHD, is defined by restless movement, impulsive actions, physical energy that simply cannot sit still. This presentation is more commonly identified in boys during primary school, precisely because it disrupts classrooms. It draws attention. It generates complaints. It leads to referrals. The inattentive presentation is different, quieter. A person with this form has difficulty sustaining focus. They lose track of conversations. Their mind drifts mid-sentence. They forget instructions given moments ago. They aren't bouncing off walls. They're floating somewhere inside their own head. This is the form more commonly found in girls, and the form more commonly missed. U.S. data from the Centers for Disease Control, collected between 2020 and 2022, shows that 15% of boys aged 5 to 17 had ever been diagnosed with ADHD, compared to 8% of girls, a ratio of roughly 1.9 to 1 in diagnosed rates. But population-based studies, the kind that screen everyone rather than waiting for referrals, consistently find a true prevalence ratio closer to 2.28 to 1. The gap between those two numbers represents children who have the condition but were never identified. Most of them are girls. Studies of teacher referral behavior reveal a consistent pattern. Teachers refer boys for ADHD evaluation more often than girls, regardless of symptom type. The largest gap in referrals occurs for hyperactivity without aggression, the visible, disruptive profile that defines the cultural image of the condition. But here is a finding that is hard to sit with. Teachers sometimes rate girls with ADHD as more impaired than boys with ADHD in the same classroom, yet still recommend evaluation and medication less frequently for the girls. Both parents and teachers are less likely to seek ADHD services when the described child is female. In Denmark, registry data showed the male-to-female ratio in school-age ADHD diagnosis dropping from 7.5 to 1 all the way down to 3 to 1 between 1995 and 2010. Not because boys' rates fell, because recognition of ADHD in girls improved. The ratio's movement over time is itself a record of how diagnostic culture shifted. Much of the boy disorder framing of ADHD was a sociological artifact, not a biological reality. The predominantly hyperactive impulsive subtype of ADHD shows the largest sex disparity in clinical samples, historically as high as 9 to 1. And that makes sense, because this subtype aligns most visibly with disruptive classroom behavior. The inattentive subtype, the most common presentation in women, shows a true prevalence ratio closer to 2 to 1 or 3 to 1. A 2025 item-level systematic review found that females were more likely to endorse specific inattentive symptoms, while males endorsed more hyperactive impulsive items. Even within the same diagnostic category, the expression diverges in ways that cause clinical instruments calibrated on male samples to underestimate ADHD severity in women. The tools were built for one kind of brain. They work less well when pointed at another. So the girl who stares out the window doesn't get referred. She moves to secondary school. She develops her own strategies. She watches what other students do, how they organize their binders, how they remember deadlines, how they keep track of homework, and she copies those systems. She builds workarounds for problems nobody else can see. She studies twice as long to absorb what her peers manage in half the time. She writes lists. She sets alarms. She stays up late. She feels like she's working harder than everyone around her and yet barely keeping up. She doesn't know why. Nobody does. This is the beginning of masking. Masking, sometimes called camouflaging, is the sustained and effortful concealment of ADHD traits. It's the performance of neurotypical behavior at a high cognitive cost. It takes several forms, and each one is worth understanding. There is compensation. This means scripting conversations in advance, building elaborate systems to work around memory failures, over-preparing for meetings and events to avoid visible mistakes. The compensating person doesn't appear disorganized because they've spent 3 hours organizing what someone else did in 20 minutes. There is assimilation. This means studying other people's behavior, mimicking social norms, people-pleasing, avoiding conflict at all costs. The assimilating person appears socially skilled because they've been watching, learning, rehearsing what normal looks like since childhood. And there is masking proper. This means actively suppressing visible symptoms, sitting still when your body wants to move, slowing your speech when your thoughts are racing, filtering impulsive comments before they become words, pushing down emotional reactions that feel too big for the moment. All of this is invisible to the outside world. That is the point. The mask works, and because the mask works, nobody sees the effort behind it. The Camouflaging Autistic Traits Questionnaire, a validated 25-item self-report measure originally developed for autism research, has been adapted and tested across neurodevelopmental conditions. A 2024 study conducted in the Netherlands with 315 age-matched participants found that adults with ADHD report higher masking scores than neurotypical controls. Assimilation scores, the tendency to study and mimic the behavior of others, were particularly elevated. Adults with ADHD camouflage more than neurotypical people. The mask is real, and it's measurable. Girls with ADHD who aren't recognized, who are instead labeled chatty or dreamy, or disorganized or overly emotional, learn early that their natural operating mode is considered unacceptable. They adapt. Interviews with women who received late ADHD diagnoses reveal a consistent theme running through their stories. Years of interpreting internal struggles as personal failures, not neurological differences. And here's the thing. Even when girls display equal or greater levels of ADHD-related impairment compared to boys, medication is recommended less often for girls in clinical settings. This systemic bias compounds across decades. Girls who aren't referred, not diagnosed, not treated, develop increasingly sophisticated masking strategies as a survival mechanism. Those strategies then make their ADHD invisible to future clinicians as well. The mask that protects you also hides you from the help you need. But the mask has a cost, a real one, and it accumulates over years in ways that are not just psychological but physiological. The concept of allostatic load describes the wear and tear the body accumulates when the stress response system stays chronically activated. For women with ADHD who mask extensively, this load builds through several channels at once. The hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the body's central stress response system, becomes dysregulated. Cortisol patterns may initially run high, then eventually flatten as the system exhausts itself. That flattening is a pattern associated with burnout. The immune system shows signs of chronic stress. Inflammatory markers rise. The sympathetic nervous system stays activated. The calming influence of the vagus nerve diminishes. And at the surface level, women with ADHD who mask heavily report higher rates of tension headaches, jaw clenching, gastrointestinal problems, and chronic fatigue. The body keeps a record of what the mind tries to conceal. ADHD burnout, the state of collapse that follows prolonged overcompensation, is frequently mistaken for depression. The symptoms overlap: extreme fatigue, cognitive fog, emotional numbness, withdrawal, loss of motivation. But the underlying mechanism is different. Burnout is a nervous system that has reached the end of its compensatory capacity, not a primary mood disorder. It's what happens when the effort of appearing normal finally exceeds what the brain and body can sustain. And when a woman in burnout seeks help, what she receives is often a prescription for antidepressants, a treatment for the consequence, not the cause. The Stockholm Population Study, the one that tracked over 2.4 million residents across a decade, found a specific pharmacological signature of this pattern. Women with ADHD were using more sedatives, antidepressants, insomnia medication, and pain medications before their ADHD diagnosis than any other comparison group. That is a medical record, not of treatment working, of a healthcare system repeatedly addressing the consequences of unrecognized ADHD while leaving the root condition untouched. The word stress barely covers it. Consider what it means to live for 15 or 20 years inside a brain that processes the world differently from how the world expects you to process it, and to believe, the entire time, that the gap between your performance and everyone else's is your fault. You develop anxiety, real anxiety. You develop depression, real depression. But the anxiety and depression are not primary conditions. They are consequences of undiagnosed ADHD, years of compensating, overperforming, and constantly failing to meet a neurotypical standard. The chronic stress depletes self-esteem. The burnout follows. And then those secondary conditions become the diagnosis. The ADHD gets buried beneath them. Up to 75% of adult women with ADHD are estimated to have been previously misdiagnosed before receiving an accurate ADHD diagnosis. That is 3 out of 4. The most common preliminary diagnoses are generalized anxiety disorder and major depressive disorder. The overlaps are real. Generalized anxiety shares symptoms with ADHD: poor concentration, restlessness, fatigue, irritability. When a woman describes these experiences to a clinician unfamiliar with inattentive ADHD in adults, anxiety is often the first conclusion reached. Borderline personality disorder is another common misdiagnosis, characterized by emotional dysregulation, rejection sensitivity, and identity disturbance. Research suggests that up to 1 in 3 women diagnosed with borderline personality disorder may actually meet criteria for ADHD or autism when assessed with neurodivergent informed tools. The conditions are not the same, but when you don't know what you're looking for, the patterns blur together. Let's look at the numbers directly. A study presented at the European College of Neuropsychopharmacology Congress in Amsterdam, led by Dr. Silvia Amoretti from Barcelona, examined a clinical sample of 900 adults diagnosed with ADHD for the first time at a specialized outpatient program. Women in the study received their diagnosis at an average age of 28.96 years. Men received theirs at an average age of 24.13 years, a gap of nearly 5 years. And here is the part that matters most. Symptoms appeared at the same age in both groups. The delay is not developmental, it's diagnostic. The condition arrives on time. Recognition does not. By the time women received their diagnosis, they showed more severe symptoms, worse daily functioning, and higher rates of psychiatric comorbidity than the men. Not because their ADHD was inherently worse, because it had been running unchecked for longer. Dr. Amoretti commented that women are likely diagnosed later because the symptoms of ADHD manifest differently in men and women. Boys are more likely to be hyperactive, the visible kind, the kind that gets noticed. The Swedish population data tells a parallel story from a different angle. The Time After Time study, led by Borg Skoglund and published in the Journal of Child Psychology and Psychiatry in December 2023, examined data from over 2.4 million residents of the Stockholm region. Over 85,000 individuals with ADHD were tracked between 2011 and 2021. Women were diagnosed at an average age of 23.5 years, men at 19.6 years. A gap of 4 years, even in Sweden, a country where ADHD awareness in women has been actively promoted for over a decade. Girls and women had more healthcare contacts and interventions before receiving their ADHD diagnosis compared to boys and men with ADHD. They were overrepresented in the use of sedatives, antidepressants, insomnia medication, and pain medication before anyone thought to screen for ADHD. Anxiety disorders were twice as common in girls and women with ADHD compared to boys and men. Eating disorders were 10 times more common. 10 times. Many women describe the moment of correct diagnosis in a particular way. Two feelings arriving at once. Relief, because finally there is a name for what they've experienced. The difficulty with focus, the emotional overwhelm, the sense that everyone else received an instruction manual that was somehow lost in the mail. It has a source. It's neurological. It's not a personal failing. And grief. Grief for the years spent believing they weren't trying hard enough, for the relationships strained by symptoms nobody recognized, for the careers derailed by burnout treated as depression, for the version of life that might have been if someone had looked a little closer a little sooner. Let us sit with that for a moment. The next group of observations concerns the experience of men with ADHD, because earlier diagnosis does not mean an easier path. Boys with ADHD are identified sooner. That is true, but early labeling carries its own weight. A child told he has a disorder at age 7 absorbs that information into his developing sense of self. The label becomes part of his identity before he has the cognitive tools to understand what it actually means. Some boys internalize the label as a limitation. Others rebel against it. Either way, the early diagnosis shapes how they're treated by teachers, by peers, by every system they move through. Men with ADHD are more likely to present with externalizing behaviors, risk-taking, substance use, impulsivity that draws clinical attention but also social consequence. Where women's ADHD often turns inward as anxiety and self-doubt, men's ADHD is more likely to turn outward as action, as disruption, as choices that generate visible problems. This isn't a clean division. Plenty of men with ADHD experience the inattentive presentation. Plenty of men mask, but the statistical patterns show a tendency, and that tendency has shaped how men move through the world carrying this condition. Think about the intersection of testosterone and dopamine for a moment. Testosterone does not cause ADHD. That's not the claim. But testosterone modulates the reward circuits that shape how ADHD expresses itself in terms of motivation and aggression. In an ADHD brain already seeking stimulation to compensate for a quiet dopamine baseline, testosterone adds fuel. It pushes behavior outward rather than inward. This is one reason why ADHD in boys tends to be louder. The neurochemical environment favors expression over suppression. The restlessness exits through the body. There's another dimension to the male ADHD experience that receives less attention than it should. Men diagnosed in childhood may outgrow their support systems while the condition persists. A boy diagnosed at 8 might receive medication, behavioral therapy, classroom accommodations. By 18, those structures begin to fall away. University doesn't offer the same monitoring. Workplaces don't check in. And men are statistically less likely to seek reevaluation in adulthood, less likely to return to a clinician and say, "This thing I was told I had as a child, it's still here." The boy was seen. The man becomes invisible in a different way entirely. Let's pause for a moment. Let the mind settle. We've been moving through the social territory of ADHD, who gets seen, who gets missed, how the same condition finds different expression depending on the body and the world around it. Now we move inward, into the brain itself, into its quieter architecture. There is a network inside your brain that is active right now, not because you're concentrating on these words, because part of your mind is doing something else entirely. It's called the default mode network. The default mode network, or DMN, is a collection of brain regions that become active during rest, during daydreaming, during moments when your attention is not directed at any particular external task. It includes the posterior cingulate cortex, the medial prefrontal cortex, the inferior parietal lobule, the lateral temporal cortex, and the angular gyrus. When you let your mind wander, when you think about what happened yesterday or imagine what might happen tomorrow, or drift into a quiet memory of someone you used to know, this network is doing its work. In a neurotypical brain, the default mode network and the task-positive network operate like a seesaw. When you need to focus on something external, reading, listening, solving a problem, the DMN quiets down and the task-positive network activates. When you return to rest, the DMN comes back online. That switching is one of the neural signatures of focused attention. The ability to suppress internal chatter when external concentration is needed. In an ADHD brain, this suppression is impaired. Multiple brain imaging studies have converged on a consistent finding. The ADHD brain shows insufficient suppression of the default mode network during tasks. The network that should quiet down when focus is required keeps generating internally directed activity. It competes with the task-positive systems for neural resources. This is the neural basis for the experience of thoughts breaking through during reading. The sentence you're trying to follow gets interrupted by an unrelated image, a fragment of memory, a sudden thought about something you need to do later. It isn't laziness. It's two networks in the brain failing to take turns. The details are more textured than a simple on-off failure. There is hypoconnectivity within the DMN's core, weaker links between the medial prefrontal cortex and the posterior cingulate cortex. This reduced internal coherence is associated with higher scores on hyperactive impulsive measures and with delay aversion, the ADHD tendency to prefer a small reward now over a larger reward later. At the same time, there is hyperconnectivity between the DMN and the frontoparietal network, two systems that should be anticorrelated, showing excessive crosstalk. They speak when they should be listening to each other's silence. And there is weaker anticorrelation between the ventral attention network and the DMN. The snap back to attention mechanism is softened. When something in the environment should pull your focus back, a voice, a sound, a change, the ADHD brain is slower to respond. Research from Linköping University in Sweden demonstrated that adults with ADHD show unusual functional connectivity between the default mode network, the ventral attention network, and auditory processing networks. This helps explain why the ADHD brain is particularly vulnerable to auditory interruption, why focusing in a noisy room can feel less like difficulty and more like a physical impossibility. The brain also shows enhanced gray matter volume within DMN regions in people with ADHD, more tissue in the system that generates wandering thought. The architecture itself may be part of why the mind keeps moving. And this network dysfunction doesn't stop when you try to rest for the night. Normally, as a person transitions from wakefulness toward rest, the default mode network undergoes a gradual decoupling. Its connectivity decreases systematically as non-REM stages deepen. The posterior cingulate cortex and medial prefrontal cortex slowly reduce their contributions as slow-wave activity takes hold. This decoupling is how the brain releases its grip on self-referential thought. It's part of the mechanism by which waking consciousness fades and restorative unconsciousness begins. In the ADHD brain, this transition is problematic. The overactive default mode network that intrudes on waking tasks keeps generating internal activity as the person lies in bed, racing thoughts at the boundary between waking and resting, replaying events, rehearsing conversations, imagining scenarios. The mind spins in place when it's trying to settle. Research published in 2025 confirmed that pre-sleep arousal, both cognitive and somatic, is a mechanistically important driver of the relationship between ADHD traits and poor quality of rest. The very mechanism that disrupts daytime focus also disrupts the nightly transition. The consequences for the architecture of rest are measurable and consistent. In the general population, the lifetime prevalence of persistent rest difficulties is roughly 36%. Among people with ADHD, that number rises to 82%. Among women with ADHD, the insomnia rate is 43.9%, compared to 12.2% in women without the condition, nearly 4 times higher. Up to 75% of adults with ADHD show a delayed circadian rhythm. Their dim light melatonin onset, the biological signal that tells the brain the day is ending, occurs approximately 90 minutes later than in adults without ADHD. Professor Coolidge has described ADHD and delayed circadian phase as two sides of the same physiological and mental coin. A 2025 perspective article in Frontiers in Psychiatry went further, characterizing ADHD as a circadian rhythm disorder. The melatonin onset delay is approximately 45 minutes in children with ADHD and about 90 minutes in adults. The biological clock itself runs on a different schedule. A 2025 EEG study found something striking. Adults with ADHD display higher slow-wave activity density during wakefulness, particularly over brain regions in the parietal and temporal areas. Slow-wave activity is the brain pattern associated with deep, restorative rest. And in ADHD, traces of this pattern appear during the day. The ADHD brain generates rest-like electrical activity while the person is ostensibly awake. and this activity statistically accounts for attentional lapses on sustained focus tasks. The line between wakefulness and drifting in the ADHD brain is, at the neurophysiological level, thinner than it is in other brains. Consider that for a moment. The brain you're using right now, whether or not it carries ADHD, has a boundary between alertness and drifting. For some brains, that boundary is a wall. For others, it's more like a curtain. Slow wave activity during actual rest, the deep stage called N3 or slow wave rest, is when the brain performs some of its most important maintenance. Growth hormone is released. The glymphatic system, a waste clearance pathway, flushes metabolic byproducts from brain tissue. Synaptic connections are pruned and consolidated. In children with ADHD, slow-wave activity is reduced by roughly 20% compared to neurotypical controls. This reduction reflects delayed cortical maturation, a finding consistent with neuroimaging data showing slower frontal lobe development in ADHD brains. The very phase that supports brain development is the phase most reduced in the developing ADHD brain. And intervention studies offer some quiet encouragement. Circadian phase can be advanced in ADHD populations through careful timing of melatonin supplementation and bright light therapy in the morning. The biological clock can be nudged, not overwritten, but gently shifted toward an earlier rhythm. There's something almost poetic in that. Light, the simplest external signal, adjusting the timing of a brain that struggles with time. Because time is one of the great difficulties of ADHD, not clock reading or schedule keeping, though those are affected too. The internal sense of time itself. People with ADHD often describe a relationship with time that differs from what others experience. An hour can feel like 10 minutes. 5 minutes can feel like an hour. Deadlines that are weeks away feel abstract, unreal, until they're hours away and suddenly feel like an emergency. The prefrontal cortex plays a role in time perception. When dopamine activity in that region runs lower, the internal clock runs differently. The future feels farther away. The present feels like the only time that truly exists. Sit with that observation for a moment. The present moment is very real to an ADHD brain. Whatever is happening right now has a vividness that distant obligations cannot match. This is why a person with ADHD might spend 3 hours absorbed in a hobby while a deadline looms, not because they don't care about the deadline, but because the present experience is neurochemically louder than the future one. This feature of ADHD, sometimes called hyperfocus, is one of the condition's paradoxes. A brain that struggles to maintain attention on things that don't interest it can lock onto something that does interest it with startling intensity. Hours disappear. Meals are skipped. The rest of the world fades. Hyperfocus isn't a superpower in the way popular media sometimes frames it. It isn't controllable. You can't choose what captures you. And the disorientation of surfacing from deep focus to find that the day has passed can be as disruptive as the inability to focus in the first place. But it's a window into the nature of the condition. ADHD is not a deficit of attention. It's a dysregulation of attention. The system doesn't lack the ability to focus. It lacks the ability to direct that focus where it's needed when it's needed. This distinction matters. It changes how we understand the person behind the diagnosis. A person with ADHD is not someone who can't pay attention. They are someone whose attentional system operates on different rules. The dopamine threshold for engagement is higher. The executive override for boredom is weaker. The emotional coloring of tasks has outsized influence on whether the brain will cooperate. A task that is interesting, novel, urgent, or emotionally meaningful will activate the system. A task that is routine, abstract, or emotionally neutral may fail to generate enough dopamine to hold attention at all, regardless of how important the person knows it to be. This is why just try harder doesn't help someone with ADHD. It's like telling someone with poor eyesight to just look harder. The hardware needs support, not more effort. Let us circle back quietly to something we touched on earlier: racing thoughts. For many women with ADHD, hyperactivity does not exit through the body. It enters the mind. The neurobiological substrate is the same: an arousal system that struggles to settle, a basal ganglia that seeks stimulation, a prefrontal cortex that can't easily suppress competing activity. But the behavioral output is different. Instead of a child who can't sit still, you find an adult whose inner world never stops moving. The mind jumps between topics, rapid-fire associations, difficulty silencing internal dialogue, a constant sense of inner restlessness, even while the body is perfectly still, and rehearsal, mentally running through conversations before they happen, replaying interactions afterward, trying to edit words that have already been spoken. This is what internalized hyperactivity looks like. And because it's invisible to everyone else, it's invisible to clinicians too. Research published in Psychiatry Research in 2021 and confirmed by follow-up studies in 2023 established something important. Racing thoughts in ADHD are neuropsychologically distinct from mind wandering. They're not the same phenomenon in different clothing. Mind wandering is associated with deficits in attentional control and predicts inattentive symptoms. Racing thoughts are different. They're specifically linked to emotional lability, motor hyperactivity indicators, and semantic overactivation. The brain's meaning-making networks firing too broadly, generating too many associations at once. And here's the clinically important part. Only the racing thoughts dimension, not mind wandering, was associated with self-reported functional difficulties in daily life. For women whose hyperactivity lives almost entirely in this internal domain, the symptom most predictive of real-world impairment is the one no external observer can detect. Emotional dysregulation is now increasingly recognized as a core component of ADHD, not a side effect, not a comorbidity, a central feature of how the condition works. A controlled study published in 2025 examined emotional dysfunction in adult women with ADHD and found that emotional dysregulation was directly tied to ADHD symptom severity and executive functioning impairment. Women with diagnosed ADHD were distinguished from neurotypical controls not by the presence of emotions. Everyone has those, but by the use of non-adaptive regulation strategies, including negative affect and alexithymia, the difficulty identifying and describing one's own emotional states. The same dopamine deficit that makes it hard to focus on a spreadsheet also makes it hard to modulate the intensity of feelings. The emotion arrives too fast, too strong, and the prefrontal cortex, the brain's brake pedal, can't engage quickly enough to slow it down. Consider the experience of rejection sensitivity. This is a term that appears frequently in discussions of ADHD, the tendency to experience perceived rejection as intensely painful, far out of proportion to the situation. A canceled plan feels like abandonment. A piece of constructive feedback feels like a verdict on your worth. A friend who doesn't text back feels like proof that you were never wanted in the first place. This isn't sensitivity in the casual sense. It's a neurological response, the emotional regulation system failing to buffer the impact of a social signal. The pain is real. The interpretation may be distorted, but the feeling itself is not manufactured. For women who have spent years masking, years performing competence, years building an identity on the fragile scaffolding of compensation, the stakes of rejection feel even higher, because the mask only holds if no one looks too closely. One crack, and the whole structure threatens to give way. Let us slow down. You've been listening for a while now. Your breathing may have shifted, settled into a rhythm that doesn't require your attention. We are more than halfway through our journey tonight. The observations ahead are gentler. They concern the brain's relationship with movement, with screens, with the slow approach of rest itself. There is a phenomenon that clinicians have observed in both ADHD and gifted minds, a kind of magnetic pull toward screens. Computers, phones, tablets. The rapid reward cycle of digital media temporarily satisfies the dopamine deficit that defines the ADHD brain. Every notification, every new page, every scroll delivers a small pulse of dopamine, not enough to fix the underlying issue, but enough to feel like relief. And so the person stays. An hour passes, then two. Then the evening is gone, and the thing they intended to do sits untouched on the kitchen counter. This isn't a willpower problem. It's a brain seeking the chemical it needs from the easiest available source. The screen provides what the prefrontal cortex can't generate on its own, a steady drip of stimulation that keeps the system from falling into the uncomfortable void of understimulation. And boredom in the ADHD brain is not what it is in a neurotypical brain. It's not mild discomfort. It's a state of genuine neurological distress, the arousal system running too low, the brain calling out for input, the prefrontal cortex unable to generate motivation from within. But there's another source of dopamine the brain responds to, one that doesn't carry the same cost. Movement. Exercise triggers the release of dopamine, norepinephrine, and serotonin. It engages the very neurotransmitter systems that ADHD medications target, and the effect isn't subtle. After vigorous exercise, people with ADHD frequently report improved focus, better mood regulation, reduced impulsivity. The improvement can last for an hour or more. Research has shown that the cellular response to exercise training is remarkably similar between men and women. The muscles adapt. The cardiovascular system responds. The brain chemistry shifts. The sex differences in ADHD don't extend to the fundamental mechanisms by which the body benefits from physical activity. What does differ is access and habit. Women with undiagnosed ADHD who are running on burnout and chronic stress may have little energy left for exercise. The very intervention that would help the most feels out of reach when the compensatory systems are already depleted. Picture a woman at the end of a long day. She knows a walk would help. She knows movement would clear the fog. But her executive function, the brain system responsible for initiating tasks, is the very system that's impaired. She needs dopamine to generate the motivation to do the thing that would generate dopamine. This is the paradox at the heart of ADHD self-management. The condition, impairs the system that manages the condition. Let's return now to the body's need for nightly rest, because you may be approaching yours. Slow-wave rest, the deepest stage of the non-REM cycle, is when the brain performs some of its most important maintenance work. Growth hormone is released. The glymphatic system flushes metabolic waste. Synaptic connections are pruned and consolidated, strengthened where it matters and weakened where it doesn't. In children with ADHD, this slow-wave activity is reduced by about 20% compared to neurotypical controls. The reduction reflects delayed cortical maturation, consistent with neuroimaging data showing slower frontal lobe development. The very phase that supports brain development is the phase most compromised in the developing ADHD brain. And that pattern, while it can improve with age, leaves traces. In adults, the picture shifts but doesn't disappear. The circadian delay, that 90-minute shift in melatonin onset, means many adults with ADHD are biologically inclined to fall into rest later and wake later than conventional schedules allow. They're not night owls by choice. They're night owls by neurology. When forced into early schedules for work or school, for the rhythms of a world built on neurotypical timing, they accumulate a rest deficit. They run chronically underrested, and insufficient rest worsens every symptom of ADHD. Attention, emotional regulation, impulse control, all deteriorate when the brain hasn't had enough time in its deeper stages. It's a cycle. ADHD disrupts nightly rest. Disrupted rest worsens ADHD. The system feeds itself. But intervention studies suggest the cycle can be nudged. Circadian phase can be advanced through careful timing of melatonin and morning light exposure. The clock can't be rewritten, but it can be gently shifted. Light, the simplest signal in the world, adjusting the rhythm of a brain that runs on its own schedule. There is something worth noticing about how different the screen pull looks in men and women with ADHD. Men with ADHD are more likely to seek stimulation through action, through risk, through physical novelty. The screen pull in men often leads to gaming, to competitive activities, to content that generates arousal and intensity. The dopamine hit comes from winning, from speed, from unpredictability. Women with ADHD are more likely to seek stimulation through connection and information. The screen pull in women more often takes the form of social media scrolling, text conversations that go on for hours, deep research spirals into topics that caught their interest at 11 at night. The dopamine hit comes from novelty and from the feeling of understanding something new. Neither pattern is better or worse. Both are the same underlying mechanism, the same dopamine-seeking behavior, expressed through different social channels and different reward preferences. And here's where we can widen our view for a moment. Think about the number of dopamine molecules released in your brain during a single moment of reward. A small pulse, maybe a few thousand molecules crossing from one neuron to the next, triggering a cascade of signals that makes you feel, for an instant, that something is worth your attention. Now think about a small star cluster, a globular cluster drifting through the halo of a galaxy, containing maybe 100,000 stars, held together by gravity in a structure that has persisted for billions of years. The scales are obviously different, but the principle of organization is oddly similar. Small units, held in a structure, creating something larger than any one component could produce alone. Neurons in a circuit, stars in a cluster. The patterns repeat across scales, from the microscopic to the cosmic, and neither the dopamine molecule nor the star has any idea what it's part of. That quiet observation is just for you. Hold it or let it go. Let us move gently into the final group of facts for tonight. These concern how the understanding of ADHD is changing. For decades, ADHD was framed as a childhood behavior problem, something that boys had, something medication could manage, something most people would outgrow. Each of those assumptions has been challenged. ADHD is not limited to childhood. Longitudinal studies show that the majority of children diagnosed with ADHD continue to meet criteria in adulthood. The symptoms may shift. Hyperactivity often becomes internal restlessness. Impulsivity becomes poor planning rather than physical recklessness, but the underlying neurology persists. ADHD is not limited to boys. The diagnostic culture that created the boy disorder framing was shaped by referral patterns, not biology. And ADHD isn't simply managed by medication. Medication is one tool and an important one, but the full picture includes rest hygiene, exercise, environmental design, emotional regulation strategies, hormonal awareness, and a social context that understands the condition for what it actually is. New phenotyping tools are being developed now. Clinical interview frameworks designed to identify internalized hyperactivity and chronic masking in adults who were missed as children. These tools ask different questions. Instead of "does this person fidget in their chair?" they ask, "does this person experience racing thoughts that make it difficult to relax?" Instead of "does this person interrupt others?" they ask, "does this person rehearse conversations repeatedly before they happen?" The questions are changing because the understanding is changing. The shift is from viewing ADHD as a deficit to understanding it as a neurological difference, not a difference that erases the real struggles. Those are documented, measurable, and present, but a difference that interacts with hormones, with social expectations, with the particular body and life in which it exists. The same condition in a boy's brain, shaped by testosterone and expressed through movement, draws a referral at age 8. The same condition in a girl's brain, shaped by estrogen and expressed through internal restlessness, draws a diagnosis of anxiety at age 22. Same neurochemistry, different context, different outcome. And this is perhaps the most important observation we can carry forward tonight. Diagnosis is not a label, it's a lens, one that can reframe decades of quiet struggle into something that finally makes sense. A woman who spent 30 years believing she was lazy, undisciplined, or too emotional learns that her brain has been running on a different operating system the entire time. The difficulty was never about effort. The effort was always there, often more effort than anyone around her ever knew. Let us hold that gently. It's not a dramatic realization, it's a quiet one. The same dopamine molecule that drives a child to leap from his chair in a classroom also drives a woman to silently rehearse a conversation 40 times before it happens. Same molecule, same circuits, different expression, different consequences. A boy is told he has ADHD. A girl is told she needs to try harder. Both carry the same neurological signature. Both deserve to be understood. And now, as we near the end of tonight's journey, let the facts settle. Let the science soften around the edges. We've been walking through the architecture of a restless mind, through dopamine and estrogen, through masking and diagnosis, through the default mode network and the thin boundary between waking and drifting. Your brain is doing all of these things right now. Dopamine is moving through circuits you can't feel. Neurons are firing in patterns that shape your attention without your awareness. The default mode network may be rising as your focus on these words begins to loosen. That's fine, let it happen. No two nervous systems process the world in exactly the same way. The brain you carry is not the same as the brain beside you. It's not the same as the brain of the person who diagnosed you, or the person who misdiagnosed you, or the person who never thought to ask the question at all. Each brain is an arrangement of roughly 100 billion neurons, connected by trillions of synapses, bathed in a particular chemical environment that shifts across hours, across months, across a lifetime. The variation is enormous. ADHD is one expression of that variation, not a flaw in the system, one of the many ways a human brain can be wired. The dopamine that shapes attention in the morning fades in the evening. The estrogen that supports executive function in 1 week of the cycle withdraws in the next. The default mode network that generates wandering thoughts during the day also generates the drifting half-images that come just before the mind lets go of the day. These aren't separate systems. They're the same brain doing different things at different times. And right now, in the quiet dark, your brain is beginning its nightly transition. Attention loosens. Thoughts lose their edges. The prefrontal cortex, which has been working all day to filter, to organize, to prioritize, begins to let go. This is not failure. This is the brain doing what it's designed to do when the day ends. Somewhere in the world right now, a woman is lying awake. Her mind is moving. She's thinking about a conversation she had 4 hours ago. She's wondering if she said the wrong thing. She's composing tomorrow's to-do list and remembering something from childhood and thinking about all of these things at once. Her default mode network is active. Her dopamine baseline is low. Her estrogen is in its luteal decline, and she has never been told that any of this has a name. Somewhere else, a man is staring at his phone. He knows he should put it down, but the screen holds him. The rapid reward cycle is giving his brain what it can't generate on its own. He was diagnosed as a child, but the medication stopped at 18. No one told him the condition would follow him here, into adulthood, into this bedroom, into this late hour. These are the quiet expressions of a restless mind. They happen in millions of bedrooms every night. Most of the people experiencing them don't know they share something in common. The science is catching up. Slowly, the way science always does. New tools are being built. New questions are being asked. The image of ADHD is widening, from the hyperactive boy in the classroom to the full spectrum of human attention, human motivation, human emotion. It will take time. Understanding always does. And in the meantime, the brain continues its work. Sorting, shifting, settling. The dopamine that was moving through your reward circuits an hour ago has been recycled. The neurons that were firing to keep you focused are quieting now. Slow-wave activity is building. The default mode network is beginning its nightly loosening, no longer generating anxious rehearsal, but gently releasing the structures of the day. Thoughts become softer, lighter, less attached to meaning. You don't need to follow them anymore. Let them pass like the slow drift of clouds across a dark sky. The universe outside your window is doing what it always does. Stars burning through hydrogen at rates that won't change for billions of years. Light traveling distances that have no meaningful human name. Galaxies rotating at speeds so slow it would take millions of years to notice the movement. And inside your skull, 100 billion neurons are doing their own quiet work, pruning connections made today, strengthening the ones that matter, preparing the architecture for tomorrow. This is happening without your effort, without your attention, without your control. Rest is not a switch. It arrives in stages. First, the thoughts thin out. Then the body releases its tension, muscle by muscle. Then the border between thought and dream becomes impossible to locate. You're no longer listening to these words. You're somewhere between hearing and remembering, between the day and whatever comes after. That is enough. You don't need to understand it all tonight. The science will be here in the morning. And somewhere in the gentle dark, the brain does what it has always done. It sorts, it shifts, it settles. Rest arrives not all at once, but slowly like a tide.